warm welcome to episode 1 of the new police TV series Manifesto for Change, Preventing Male Violence in Policing. I'm Professor Louise Mullany from the University of Nottingham. I've worked in the area of gender and workplace communication, including policing, for the past 25 years, and I'm going to be the chair of your panel today. This is the first in a series of episodes exploring the scale and impact of male violence within policing, and we'll be drawing on a range of expert evidence from inside and outside of policing to engage in informed debate. Throughout 2021, the policing of violence against women and girls has come under significant scrutiny. There is acknowledgement that police forces are consistently failing to protect women and girls from sexual and violent crime, and from violence at the hands of police officers and staff. And many have compared the rape, murder and murder of Sarah Everard as a watershed moment for policing, in a similar way to the murder of Stephen Lawrence. The gap between what the public need from policing and what they get, especially for women, people of colour and people from marginalised communities, has grown significantly. Trust, confidence and legitimacy for many in policing is broken. Within the backdrop of this context, the intention of each episode is to explore how policing actually works so we can better understand why it goes wrong and whether there are solutions that can address systematic failings. Our aim is to include recommendations and create radical and deliverable interventions through open discussion and debate. In this opening panel, we are going to be discussing the scale, impact and establishing a will to change. And I'm delighted to be joined by a panel of renowned experts to launch the series. I will now go through and introduce each of the panel members to you. So firstly, we have Louisa Rolfe, Assistant Commissioner for Metropolitan Police Operations. Louisa has over 29 years experience in policing, working for a number of police forces across the country. As the National Police Chiefs Council lead for domestic abuse, she led the UK police response to HMIC's report, Everyone's Business, focused on improving the response to domestic abuse. She was awarded an OBE in the New Year's Honours of 2019 for this work. In June 2020, Louisa joined the Metropolitan Police Service as Assistant Commissioner for Met Operations. She has responsibility for over 10,000 police officers and staff and the delivery of multi-specialist capabilities to support operational policing across London. Louisa has now taken on the role of MPCC lead for violence and public protection and is leading on the Metropolitan Police Service's response to violence against women and girls. Our second guest today is Jane Monckton-Smith. Jane is Professor of Public Protection at the University of Gloucestershire. She specialises in homicide, coercive control and stalking. In addition to her academic work, she maintains a diverse portfolio of professional and casework. She works with families bereaved through homicide, helping them with criminal justice and other processes. She advises homicide review panels, as well as chairing statutory domestic homicide reviews. She advises police on both current and cold investigations, as well as in crisis risk assessments. She trains police and other professionals in assessing threat and risk cases of domestic violence and recognising and identifying suspicious deaths. Her most recent book, In Control, Dangerous Relationships and How They End in Murder, explains her work in creating the homicide timeline, which shows how and why homicide risk may be escalating in cases of coercive control and stalking. Her latest work has focused on tracking risk escalation in domestic abuse-related suicide and a framework for identifying so-called hidden homicides, that is, sudden and unexpected deaths that have a history of domestic abuse. Our next panel member is Zoe Billingham. Until recently, Zoe was Her Majesty's Inspector for Policing and Fire Services, a position that she has held for an unprecedented 12 years. She has long advocated and promoted improvement in policing services to the most vulnerable, with a focus on domestic abuse and mental health. In her last report as Her Majesty's Inspector, she achieved unanimous support from across the sector for her recommendations for a bold and radical whole system approach to ending the epidemic of male violence against women and girls once and for all. Most recently, Zoe has taken up positions as chair of an NHS Mental Health Foundation Trust, and she is also non-executive director of the Security Industry Authority, as well as trustee of Safe Lives. She is a respected commentator on crime and policing and is often heard on the airways, giving insight into the considerable challenges that the police face. Our final member today is Sue Fish. Sue joined Nottinghamshire Police in 1986 as a police constable, and her career has seen work across uniform and detective roles in Nottinghamshire, the West Midlands, the Metropolitan Police, and also nationally. She was Chief Constable of Nottinghamshire Police until her retirement in 2017. She was awarded the OBE for services to policing in 2008. She received the Queen's Policing Medal for Distinguished Service in 2016. And she was also awarded Upstander of the Year in the National Hate Crime Awards in 2017 for her leadership on misogyny as a hate crime. She has now established a vibrant consultancy, Starfish, working with a range of clients on transformational change, leadership and equality. She actively campaigns to have misogyny as a hate crime rolled out nationally and on policing reform. She also holds a number of non-executive and trustee roles. And so a very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us on the panel today. And so we will start off and begin our focus on the three key areas outlined in the title of this episode: the scale of male violence in policing, its impact, and establishing a willingness to change. And I'd like to start off with the same question for all of you, and I'll address this to Zoe first of all. So Zoe, can you start us off, please? What, in your view, is the scale of male violence within policing? Is it the case of one bad apple or a bad barrel? So over to you.
Thanks, Louise, and hello, my colleagues on the panel. It's lovely to be here today. I looked back in 2018-19 at some of the concerns that the inspector at my former organisation had in respect of police officers abusing their position for sexual gain, and we called that report Shining a Light on Betrayal. And what was very evident to us at that point, and bearing in mind this is 2 years ago and that hasn't been refreshed since, is while the incidents are infrequent and seldom, there's not, sadly, a position to be particularly reassuring in saying that it is only one bad apple. When we looked at the scale of referrals, for example, into the Independent Office of Police Complaints, as to the number of referrals they were receiving, there were numbers going into the hundreds of concerns that had been identified through police officers standing up and stepping forward and identifying concerns about their colleagues, but also counter-corruption units within the public protection units really having in place strong measures to guard against those who have an inclination to prey entering into policing inappropriately. And we identified that in that report, there were a number of steps and measures that the police still needed to take in order to root out that type of corruption. And some of those measures, I think, have been taken forward and embraced very enthusiastically by the police. I think there's improvements now being seen on vetting, which is just the first line of defence. But I think we also identified this whole sense that there needs to be that culture of encouraging people not to be bystanders, but to be upstanders, to step forward and not to accept seemingly inappropriate behaviour in workplaces. And I think that that's probably the area where the police are now focusing the most, to make sure that that culture of no tolerance of these types of behaviours or signal behaviours that may hint at underlying proclivities of individuals, there's no place for that in policing, and that there's very clear measures for staff who have concerns about that individual who may just not seem quite right, that they can step forward. And then there's sufficient capacity and capability within the counter-corruption units to be able to take the steps to identify whether or not that person is a real concern. I think it's a journey that the police is moving forward on, and I think it's a journey that they're certainly heading in the right direction on. But your question is, can we guarantee at this moment in time whether or not it could happen again, or whether we can be certain that it wasn't just one bad apple? I think no, not at this stage, but it's something that the police are embracing.
Okay, thank you, Zoe. And we'll come back to some of those critical issues later on in the discussion. Louisa, can I hand over to you now and get your views on this, please?
Thank you. So in terms of the scale of this, it's hard to have a definitive picture, and I'll try to explain why. So the best data we probably have is the misconduct data, but I think the caveat I would have to that is that, like in the general population, we know that offences of abuse and sexual violence are underreported. So we've got to be realistic and appreciate that this is likely to be underreported in policing as well, for all kinds of reasons. But the data that the IOPC held, and also there's been some brilliant work by journalists. Sadly, I'd like to think that policing itself is rooting all of this out, but a number of journalists, in particular Alexandra Heel, have done great work where through Freedom of Information Act requests, they've established a scale of this. And whilst the numbers in the hundreds sound, alarming, and of course any one of these cases is alarming, that when you look at our data, it works out between 1% and 2% of the workforce. So 132,000 officers nationally, and probably a third as many again staff. So the data suggests small numbers. But I think looking at this as one bad apple is the wrong lens through which to consider this, because women don't experience, sexual violence or abuse as something that's rare or unusual. Unfortunately, this is a deeply rooted issue in our society, and police leaders, we all recognise and accept that sadly, a small number of people are attracted to the profession of policing because of the power and control that it affords them, the status, and in some cases the opportunity to abuse, which is, makes me very, very sad. Zoe mentioned our first line of defence being vetting. It is, but of course we can't be complacent and consider that is the answer and the protection, because we all can talk of examples where people have passed vetting but have then gone on to abuse in all kinds of professions. It's only a snapshot in time, and of course it's dependent on people coming forward and reporting concerns, us having information or intelligence, and vetting itself is heavily reliant on previous criminal convictions. And I think we're all well versed in sadly our challenges around securing criminal convictions for this kind of conduct and behaviour. Having said all that, I also think it's unhelpful to have a sweeping assessment. If it's not one bad apple, the other extreme is, that everyone in policing is bad. And I think that's also equally unhelpful, because the way, or one of the ways we must address this, is through the majority of our workforce who are outraged, horrified and saddened by this, taking them with us in tackling this and encouraging people to be upstanders and to challenge poor behaviour. So I suppose in answer to your question around the scale, it's at least a small percentage of our workforce, but the likelihood is that that's underreported, and then we must do much, much more to identify it and root it out. And it's unhelpful for us to describe it as a rare occurrence or an exceptional case, because whilst we've heard of horrific examples, those don't happen every day, but women experience abuse across society every day, and we must be alive to that and recognise it in policing and do everything we can, because of the power we have, the ability to take people's liberty. People should expect more of us, and we should be exemplars in this space.
Excellent. Thank you, Louisa. Jane, can I come to you next, please?
Yeah, I'd like to say I agree with a lot of what Louisa has just said. The bad apple argument isn't really particularly helpful, and it's an argument that we have in the context of policing, but it's an argument that we also have in the context of wider society, that violence against women and girls is committed by a few bad apples. We know that isn't the case. Even people who deny that violence against women and girls is a problem of the scale that it actually is, we'll still talk about things like safety advice to women when they're going out alone, and victim blaming, and in even having those conversations, even deniers are admitting that this is a widespread problem and we can't identify always who the abusers are. But, to put it in a little soundbite, if you like, a bad apple can infect other apples, we know, and a bad apple will thrive in a bad barrel. So, I think that what we should do maybe is look at the real scale of the issue, which has been raised. The scale is actually a bit overwhelming. And when we look at the probable scale, how on earth would we deal with that? How on earth would we approach that, given that we're almost saying that our entire culture is to blame and policing sits within that culture? And another thing, talking about scale, police officers are going to be, as Louisa rightly said, you're going to have some abusers and misogynists there, but you're also going to have a lot of victims, and that the research has suggested that in fact the number of abusers in policing is probably higher than the societal average, and the societal average is quite high depending on where you look on the spectrum. If we're only going to talk about homicide, that's obviously going to be smaller, but we know that this is a spectrum of problems. And I think when thinking about the scale, yes, it's overwhelming, and I think that can make it difficult to take steps forward. But even then, we know that we are under-recording a lot of very serious crime. Even my work is in homicide, and part of the work that I'm doing is looking at sudden unexpected deaths that are not recorded or identified as suspicious, and so are not being investigated. And some of the findings from that piece of research, which isn't published yet, are that we have preconceived ideas about some of the victims, and that is impacting on the decisions that are made. And as I'm looking at mainly the deaths of women and vulnerable people, those decisions are sometimes influenced by misogyny and misogynistic culture. So I think that we have to acknowledge once and for all, this is a problem. It's not just a UK problem, it's a global problem. And we must acknowledge, and we all admit it really, in the way that we talk about women's safety. And it's going to take serious change and leadership, not just within the police, but politically as well. And, and resourcing, the old resourcing argument, for things to change.
Thank you, Jane. Can I come to you now, Sue, please, for your thoughts?
Thanks very much. And I have a great deal of support for what Zoe, Louisa and Jane have described. And I think what I'd like to say is that many really good people come into policing for the best of reasons, the best of intentions, and they continue to make an amazing difference both to individuals that they come into contact through their policing career, but also to wider society. However, I would say that however decent people are, and as I say, many police officers are, then the sort of the pool that they swim in, I think the system makes it really, really difficult for them to, I guess, maximise the potential good that they can do. And some of that we've talked about already in terms of that wider societal challenge, that wider cultural norm. And also, as both Louisa and Jane have mentioned, the added attraction to some people who particularly find authority, power, status and the opportunity to abuse through that very attractive to policing. So I guess that I would sort of start off my remarks in that context. And Jane her specialism is homicide. So since the femicide census began in 2009, 16 women have been killed at the hands of serving or former police officers. And so that, in my mind, maths is more than one a year. So whilst homicide is rare, actually we can go through that litany of appalling offences, from rape, voyeurism, sexual exploitation, child abuse, taking photos of murder victims, sharing such images, racist, sexist, homophobic messaging, exploiting vulnerable women. I really don't need to go on. But also, so there are those who see either the opportunity or are perhaps more manifestly predatory as opposed to more opportunistic in terms of, but I think it's the normalization, and particularly, and I don't know whether it is particularly, my policing career, half of it was as a chief officer. So what do I really know? It's a bit like the Queen always thinks everyone smells of fresh paint, because whenever you go out on patrol, everyone mostly is on best behaviour and things like that, and how real do you get a sense, how realistic a sense of the culture are you actually able to get? So I think there is something about that normalisation. And also what we've seen in a number of high profile cases, and indeed I saw through some of my policing career, is the power of normalisation. So actually things aren't noticed, things aren't reported. Blind eyes are turned if something is seen. And if someone has the courage to stand up, on some occasions, we know there's really good support for individuals, but actually I've been inundated, particularly over the last year, with particularly women, but not exclusively, both members of the public and police officers coming forward to tell me about their experiences at the hands, the abuse they have experienced at the hands of police officers, serving police officers exclusively, and that when they've tried to complain, when they've tried to report it, they have been diminished, ignored, marginalised, or indeed in turn investigated or prosecuted. So there is something about how that culture responds to that threat and that challenge of calling this sort of behaviour out, which frequently is criminal and frequently very seriously criminal. So I think that's an additional challenge of how the culture actually manifests and how it diminishes and hides the scale of the problem. So actually how we determine it, I think, is really, really hard. Probably the best proxy is the one that Jane used, is that police officers and indeed the victims in policing are likely to be greater than that outside of policing. And that feels a fairly horrendous prospect, but I think that my sense is that is the reality.
Thank you, Sue. Right, I want us to pick up on two key points that are coming through really clearly now. One around policing culture, thinking about this in more detail, current values, behaviours, language that's used. What is it that is preventing people from coming forward and diminishing these reports that we know are there? We know that all crimes in terms of violence against women and girls are underreported, as has been said already, both in society and within policing as well. So what is it in particular about current policing culture in terms of behaviour, values and the language that's used that is causing these barriers, both in terms of people coming forward, but also in terms of barriers to reform? Louisa, can I come to you first on this, please?
Of course, yes. So in terms of barriers, I mean, this is something I've thought about an awful lot. And I think Sue's point really struck me when she talked about half of her career being a chief officer. And this is a conversation we were having at a senior leaders event in the Met the other day, this reality where we'd run some listening circles with women across the organisation, and our women's network have been doing some brilliant work with a number of other forces where they have encouraged women to come forward and report things anonymously, but they've captured their, been willing to record their accounts that we shared. It was, it's one of those things that hits you in the guts when you hear it. But also, I think what really struck me is this reality that as senior leaders in policing, you often will see the fresh paint and people on their best behaviour. So how do we get beneath that? And I think there's definitely something about having all the right systems and processes in place, having a really strong grievance procedure so people can call out poor behaviour with really clear policies around whistleblowing. But it isn't all about system and process, because all those, as you mentioned, culture, I don't always think it's helpful to describe police culture as one amorphous thing, and certainly not always a bad thing. There are many strengths in police culture. Many people in policing, the vast majority, have a real, sense of service and are strong on things like empathy. And our values are often set out very clearly. We have our policing code of ethics. But when I think about why these things don't always come to the surface as they should, I think sometimes our law and order focus means that we're good at criminal justice, or not as good as we could be, but we're very focused on points to prove and evidence. We're not as good at employment law, challenging poor behaviour. Our supervisors are underconfident in calling out poor behaviour and nipping things in the bud and challenging it. So we've been doing a lot of work in the Met, and I know many forces have, about encouraging supervisors to have challenging conversations, to tackle things as they see them, because often the things that will mean victims are not confident is if they know nothing can be more damaging than you seeing that other behaviour, sometimes more subtle, less damaging behaviour, is not called out and challenged, because you'll then think, well, if they're not going to challenge that, if I come forward and say this, I may not be believed, I may not be trusted. So I think there's definitely something about our leaders and managers having the confidence to have those conversations, and us being alive to these things going on, ensuring that we have strong staff networks and support associations that can challenge us as senior people and be comfortable with being challenged and don't be defensive. I think the other thing to remember is from my experience, is that abusers tend to be incredibly manipulative people. And I think sometimes the sort of dissonance that people will feel, this sort of conflict and challenge that, in policing every day, many of our officers have an opportunity to be a hero, to be seen to be doing wonderfully courageous and wonderfully brave, but also wonderfully empathetic things, and often people will find it very hard to sort of reconcile the fact that the person that they've seen protecting vulnerable people, being a hero, working alongside them, is also a manipulative abuser. People will often find that hard, and I think we absolutely have to recognise that challenge and conflict that our people feel. Some of that will be about talking about case studies. Much of it will be about giving victims a voice in policing. And in the Met and in other forces I've worked in, some of the most powerful leadership events I've been to are where we've had people who've been brave enough to come and tell us their story about their experience in the workplace. And it really does then, I think, galvanise change and challenge, and just a constant reminder of we can never take things for granted. There will be many strengths in police culture, but also, sometimes, the other side of camaraderie and courage can be, an overweighting of those, attributes of strength. And whereas, the most important thing I've seen in policing is to be caring and to be empathetic, because our job so often requires care and empathy much more than courage and strength.
Excellent, thank you, Louisa. Zoe, can I ask you to come in on this from a HMIC perspective?
Thank you. And just to repeat, really, that I'm no longer at HMIC, but I led the work that we did both on domestic abuse, violence against women and girls, and also where police officers are intent on using their position for sexual gain. And I have to agree with what Louise has just said around this, not allowing this idea that culture is an amorphous thing, but being very clear that policing does need to create an environment where there is no place for predators. And I think possibly looking at it from that end of the lens, if you like, helps forces to establish what it is that they need to do in order to make their environment a predator-free zone. And I think there's probably 3 things that I would encourage forces to look at if they're not already, and perhaps policing more broadly. And going back to the really first principles, and Louisa and Sue both touched on this, is this big question of what is involved in being a police officer in the 21st century? What type of attitudes would we like our police officers to have? What sort of motivation do we want individuals to have to join policing? And I must say, I do despair sometimes when I still see forces advertising roles for PCs with the sort of, the pictures of the drones, the guns, the horses, and the dogs. And I know 40% of all violent crime that a newly recruited police officer will have to deal with is domestic abuse related, and 10% of all crime. And so when I go out with response officers, or used to go out with response officers, and they were slightly surprised that they're going to, in inverted commas, and this was a long time ago, yet another domestic, close inverted commas. Let's not be surprised by that, because that's going to be 2/3 to 1/4 of all of your work for the first 2 years as a police officer if you're on response. So I think being really honest and having that open and honest conversation of who we want in policing, how we attract the right people, and also how we really test on recruitment, the motivation for someone coming into policing would be really helpful. As Louisa said, I think, the measures I've talked about in previous reports around vetting, capacity and capability in ACU, and the ability to look at for counter-corruptions units to be able to track what people are doing on police IT, that's just a tiny part of the process. The big issue is about the people that we have inside our organisation. And I suppose my second point will then be, once we've looked at that question of who comes into policing, it's how we engender that culture, that environment where there is no place for predators. And Louisa, I think, spoke really eloquently, and Sue too, around the need to really grapple with that point head on. The most successful force I saw that was really tackling inappropriate behaviours was a small force, admittedly, so I'm not sure this could be done in the Met, where the experts around abuse of position went out and spoke to every frontline supervisor, sat down with them and said to them, look, these are the types of typical traits of someone who may be, in that manipulative way, looking to exploit their position as a police officer. And we all know what those traits are. These are the things to look out for. And they said, we don't want you to, kind of name names inappropriately, but are there any people that you're supervising that you just have that bad feeling about for particular reasons? And giving people that confidence to think, well, yeah, I did wonder why that person spent so much time with that victim, or, why so many people have banter with this individual in the locker room and they're seen as the life and soul of the party. And that's always a kind of slightly red flag when you're looking at some of these. Not that I've any kind of prejudice against people who enjoy partying, but, we know that there are certain traits that people need to look out for. And we also know that when we work alongside colleagues and we see them in the way that they interact with each other or others, or maybe, they stand a bit close to us, or they take too much of an interest in some particular thing, I think we've got to be a little bit more confident about being able to call that out. And some forces have done some great stuff on that through kind of going out proactively and encouraging frontline supervisors to step forward. And then there's this whole question of collectively within the police workforce, understanding at all levels of an organisation what appropriate and inappropriate behaviour looks like. And as, again, I think Louisa and Sue both said, the best way for individuals to learn about what wrong is and why it's wrong is to hear direct testimony, either from those who have experienced it from inside or within policing, the effect that it's had on them. And then I think that brings about the motivation for individuals to really test themselves as to whether or not they're being too tolerant in respect of their other colleagues' behaviours. So while culture isn't an amorphous thing, the solution to this is to create an environment where there is no place for this in organisations moving forwards.
Thank you, Zoe. Jane, can I ask you to come in here? And also, within your research, testimony, I should imagine, is quite powerful. So could you pick up on that point that's coming through quite consistently in terms of the power of storytelling and narrative and sharing experience?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it was mentioned what are the barriers for people in coming forward, and I absolutely think we know what those barriers are, and probably the biggest barrier is fear. So fear that this might be career ending, fear that you are, going against your colleagues, breaking that camaraderie that is very strong sometimes in policing, and sometimes a very, very good thing. But there is still this, there is an us and them kind of culture within the police, and are you suddenly, if you are making complaints, joining them, and you're not with us? Sometimes it can be, kind of as simple as that. And then we have to think about what's going to happen when this person complains. So if nothing happens, that can be awful. If something happens, that can be just as awful. If you have to take on your shoulders the responsibility for another colleague who may be very popular losing their job, for example, nothing happening can be as bad as something happening. And I think we have to recognise that when somebody comes forward, what is the benefit for them in coming forward? What is the benefit? Are they just going to be blamed for one person losing their job and the culture remaining exactly the same? So I think thinking about complaining or whistleblowing, perhaps we need to pull back, but that has a place. But a lot of people will not be willing to take that step forward. It's a brave step to take, isn't it, if you want a career in that organisation? And perhaps we should be thinking about storytelling and narrative, as you just mentioned, in maybe having conversations out of the context of complaining, almost as debriefs with officers, so that they can express in a confidential way, which is not blaming any individual in particular. And I think you alluded to this, Zoe, didn't you, just now when you were talking about the supervisors talking, and perhaps hearing those narratives not in the context of a complaint, but in the context of, this is my experience and this is what I'm concerned about and this is what makes me uncomfortable, where it's not quite so adversarial. Because going in with the adversarial, to me, I struggle sometimes to see what the benefit is going to be for the whistleblower.
Thank you, Jane. Sue, can I ask you to come in here, particularly picking up on where the direction of what we're looking at now in terms of processes and procedures within policing, and your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and if I could just start, I guess I'd probably respond firstly to the question of what prevents people coming forward. Well, what's been really interesting in my lived experience this year has been speaking out about not just some of my own experience as a police officer, but also listening to a large number of predominantly women who've come forward to talk to me of their experience, and speaking out again, if you like, almost on their behalf. And some of the feedback I've had both directly and indirectly, that I have thrown policing under a bus, was one of the sort of choice phrases. And indeed, one former colleague, phoned me up to say, Sue, I shouldn't be speaking to you on the phone. Have you thought about how you're being tracked, surveilled? For goodness sake, if you go to the pub, don't have a drink. A whole raft of stuff. And I'm thinking, gosh, my paranoia is nowhere near yours, mate, but thank you. But that is that sense, my description of paranoia, it was their sense of realism and their care about someone who was speaking out, if you like, not against policing, but to improve policing. But how that was heard. Now, maybe that's a responsibility I have about words that I used and my communication skills. But there's also that bit about actually that sense of how dare you challenge us? This is, and you have committed the unforgivable sin of speaking out and being disloyal to policing, because one of the great strengths of the policing culture is its sense of loyalty and solidarity in the right way at the right time. So I just sort of share that because I think that's, that's really interesting, I guess, for me to reflect on in terms of perhaps why I did what I did whilst I was still a police officer, but also why I didn't do some of the things that I could have done as a police officer at different times perhaps, but it sort of may illuminate that. But I think policing is brilliant at systems and processes. Policing has a policy for everything, a procedure for everything, but culture does eat policy, procedure, process, framework, you name it, for breakfast, lunch and dinner. So I think this is really, I think Louise is right. Those policies and procedures need to be robust, they need to be meaningful, they need to be actionable, but actually there also needs to be real accountability and follow through and consistency with those. And that takes leadership, it takes courage, it takes an unrelenting focus on this issue of addressing this corruption, this, if you like, this sort of real evil that is within, sadly, both society, but within policing, when people who come into policing are asked to give more, are expected to give more, swear an oath to the Queen that they will give more and do more and be it differently. So I think there is something very fundamental there about building that accountability. But some of the small things, I think, are also about language. So I think we've touched on a bit before. So if there's a woman murdered and it is, sadly, they are every 2 or 3 days, it's an isolated incident. I can't think of his name happily, but the man in Plymouth, and as much as I like Sean Sawyer and think he's ace, and has done some really fabulous work in this area, down in Devon and Cornwall, then I heard him say, there is no wider threat. And it is an isolated, it's a domestic incident, I think was also one of the phrases. And it's just that bit of language. It is something that is so simple, but it comes from a white male privileged perspective that simply doesn't get the experience of women. So if I'm either as a police officer, member of police staff, a member of the public, as I happily am now, if I'm hearing that and that's not my experience either personally, or I know that's not the experience of other women, I'm not going to be, that's not going to fill me with confidence. That's not going to build my trust in the fact that I would be taken seriously, or even not even knowing the sort of the poor outcomes there might be through the criminal justice system. Actually, there's something about being treated fairly, decently, with compassion and with empathy when you share your story and your experiences. And then I think one of the other pieces, which is, it's quite small, but I think it's really significant, is understanding policing networks. And I think, and by that I mean is who knows who and who worked with who, whose kids go to school with who plays five-a-side football, who coaches your kids five-a-side football, what, I don't know, I don't play football, but whatever it is, 11-a-side football, or the local rugby club, or whatever is you or your kids' thing, that is, who that you were at training school with, who you're on your CID course with. There is an extraordinary network in forces, and particularly I think with some of the regional units as well, that how that cross-fertilisation happens and what small favours are owed, whether it's simply you picked up someone's kids from school to help them out when they were legitimately late from work, or you covered up something, or you didn't say something. That sort of, how those networks build, I think has been, I don't think I was ever particularly naive about that, but I think the understanding and insight I now have into those officers who are predatory who are, as Louisa describes, incredibly manipulative. That sort of hero one moment, so they can't possibly have done anything as horrendous as you're alleging the next. Though unpicking some of that and understanding the possibility and indeed the probability, I think is really significant for policing. And I think whether that's a vast I2 chart, if that's still the right software, you know, I think would be an extraordinary thing to do, and probably impossible, and someone would say that would infringe on someone's human rights and right to private life. But I think some of the people who are really worrying in terms of their behaviours, even before the full story is known, if the full story is ever known, actually would be a fantastic case in point to be able to explore some of those. And I would also, that's, you know, whether that's the right place that to echo Louisa and Jane's points about those sort of safe spaces. So people who may have received information, you know, received messages that, yeah, it's, oh my God, you know, I can't possibly say I've had those, because then, you know, I'm, you know, I'd get investigated, as opposed to actually being able to understand those and provide safe routes, if that makes sense, for the right people in the right way, and to also understand and to be able to call out things in the right way with the right sort of support, or to be able to know there are different pathways that don't necessarily end up with those sorts of binary outcomes that Jane talked about, that are pretty awful, whichever route you take.
Thank you, Sue. Some really important points raised there. And I want us to think about impact in more detail now, and this idea of building accountability. In terms of the reviews that have taken place so far, how do you think that reviews can help re-establish trust and confidence from the public? And what level of transparency do you think is actually in place in terms of, for example, sexual misconduct cases and sexual misconduct reviews that have taken place? So what kind of moment are we at the moment, and what can be done in terms of some of the really brilliant ideas that are starting to emerge from the discussion we're having in terms of being able to improve these in future? Zoe, can I come to you first on this, please?
Yes, I think if by reviews, Louise, you're talking about what's happened post what you described in your introduction as that watershed moment, the horrific murder of Sarah Everard, and then that kind of reveal of the modus operandi of Wayne Couzens, there's been an awful lot of activity since then. The Home Secretary has commissioned work to be undertaken by Dame Eilish to review the actual timeline of Couzens' entry into and career through policing. Louisa, I know through the Met, has done brilliant work to not only bring Louise Casey in, but also to review internally the Met's own approach to tackling violence against women and girls, alongside the Mayor's office within that. But I think all of these are important, all will shed further light on a problem that we're all trying to solve. But certainly my reaction when I heard about Couzens and the immediate effect that that was going to have, I called as the then HMI leading on this work for all forces to look in an introspective way at their own positions. A, this wasn't a Met problem. B, it wasn't isolated. And C, every force in the country really needed to do a full, frank and fresh appraisal of their own position, looking from the inside out, rather than having more review processes imposed. And I suspect what's happened is every force in the country has had a look at many of the internal systems that they have to promote better behaviour, to safeguard against abuse, and to encourage an upstanding rather than a bystanding. And I think that that's all really valuable. To lift this conversation, Louise, if I may, just to make one sort of slightly broader point, and Sue's most certainly spoken about this. If we're going to tackle these types of behaviours in policing, we do need to take the step back and look at the societal context. We live in a world where an epidemic of violence against women and girls is being perpetrated on a daily basis, and there is a societal tolerance for that at the moment. Mm. And that's the thing that I think probably needs to be tackled first and foremost. When we looked at violence against women and girls as the inspectorate in my former role, we came to the very swift conclusion, working alongside Louisa, who was part and parcel of our reference group, that we can't solve this through policing alone. There needs to be a whole system approach. And part of that whole system approach is about forming and recreating the boys' attitude at a really, really early age to violence against women and girls. And that's not for one moment me, Louise, saying that we kick all of this problem into the long grass because this is too complicated, but we need to see what we're seeing replicated in policing against that broader societal backdrop, and really look at our place as commentators or people working within policing, our place to keep holding their feet to the fire on that too, because policing ain't going to solve this on their own.
Brilliant. Thank you, Zoe. Some really important points there. Jane, can I ask you to come in on this, please?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest problems for me, I think, is the status of the offending that we're talking about. So the status of domestic abuse, for example, as an offence, as a behavioural pattern is, it's very low. The victims have very low status. And look at the problems that we allegedly have with the prosecution of rape and sexual offending. And again, it just seems to be that the most difficult crimes to prosecute are those crimes where women are predominantly the victims. That's something that we need to address. And elevating the status of a problem is not necessarily impossible, is it? We just need to start talking about it in terms that give it some status. Now, I have just been doing some work on taking a forensic approach to domestic abuse and domestic homicide, just those two things at the moment. And we do not take a forensic approach to those particular crimes, whereas we do take a forensic approach to other types of crimes. They have that status that attracts the right resources. It is acknowledged that there are experts in the area that can add to the narrative, that can add to the conversation. We do not do that with domestic abuse. Now, I'm going to say something that's potentially quite controversial now, but bear with me. With domestic abuse, in this study that I've been doing, I have noticed that there is a tendency to say that domestic abuse training should be survivor-led. Okay, now we all know that the importance of victims' voices is incredibly important. And I'd also like to say that how do we decide who's a survivor and who isn't? The problem is so widespread. It's a false dichotomy to say this person's a survivor and this person isn't. The police officer themselves could be a survivor. The expert could be a survivor. So I think we've got to stop with that false dichotomy when we talk about the wider subject area and work with those people who are brave enough and willing enough to say I am a victim, because certainly they are just a proportion of the victims out there, but they have decided that they are willing to speak, and that's incredibly important. But their voices cannot sit alone, unsupported by the science and the research and this forensic approach, because we know now, don't we, from the massive body of work that's out there around domestic abuse, that we've got very effective behavioural analysis, pattern analysis, risk and threat assessment tools and processes that are based in the science. But we still talk about domestic abuse as if it's survivors talking about their experiences, and that is the extent of our knowledge of that particular area. And I do think that if domestic abuse was seen as a legitimate form of crime study, that we would get a more forensic response to the offending, a more forensic response to the victims, and a forensic response that would support what the victims are saying. At the moment, we can say, for example, that the victim voice is anecdotal. So why don't we support that anecdotal voice with the years and decades of research that is supporting exactly what that victim is saying, and will give more status to their narrative and to the crime? I hope I've explained that properly. But even in the courts, we don't really accept expert evidence of domestic abuse routinely. And sometimes we have even senior officers saying things like domestic abuse is about social work. Domestic abuse is a crime, and we have as much forensic knowledge about domestic abuse as we have about the other forms of crime that we consider are more serious. So I think that that is one way that we can start to improve the way that we look at violence against women and girls. We've got the same forensic knowledge about sexual offending, don't we? So why aren't we accepting that this is a legitimate form of crime that is serious and worthy of our attention?
Louisa, can I come to you and ask you to pick up on the point that Jane's raised there about domestic abuse, and then thinking about the original thoughts around transparency and review processes as well?
Yes, thank you. So going to Jane's point, yes, I agree. Policing could deploy a much improved approach to domestic abuse. We have made some improvements, and in terms of training, the domestic abuse matters training is evidence-based. Yes, it does include the voice of survivors, but it's something that the College of Policing and academics within the college and independently were involved in its development, and it's been piloted and tested, and the impact of it tested, and it's proven to increase both officers' understanding of the dynamics of abuse, but also their empathy with victims. So there is green shoots, Jane. I would not claim we've achieved this, and there's much more for us to do. And of course, I want domestic abuse to be on a par with offences that do receive that forensic approach, but we are improving, and there's more to do in this space. And as you've identified as well, this is not just about policing, and as Zoe said, it's about the whole criminal justice system prioritising cases of abuse. The Met is one of 5 forces nationally rolling out an approach that's working with academics at the moment to really get beneath our offences of rape and sexual offences, understand how applying an evidence-based approach can improve our outcomes, our justice outcomes, but more importantly, prevent offences of rape and sexual offences. And as I'm sure you're aware, there's a huge overlap between sexual offences and domestic abuse. I think something like 30% of offences of rape reported to police occur in a domestic abuse setting. So a significant amount of overlap there, and work that we need to do, and we must get better at this, because at the moment our justice outcomes are a long way from where we'd like them to be. Going back to your point about transparency, I think there's some of this feels like a few steps forward and then a few back. I mentioned earlier some of the brilliant work by journalists that have identified the scale of issues through things like Freedom of Information Act requests. It shouldn't be that way. The IOPC do publish data. Misconduct hearings, particularly those gross misconduct hearings, the presumption is that they should be held in public. It is a decision for the chair, and the chair of gross misconduct hearings, so cases where an officer is suspected of an offence so serious that they could be dismissed, the chair of those hearings are independent, legally qualified chairs, and it is for the chair to decide whether that case is publicly held or held in private. I think my experience is what often happens here with the subject matter, that you end up with the chairs considering I think the needs of victims and survivors and witnesses alongside the public sort of right to see the details of that offence or offending or the case. And so sometimes those decisions are made in a way that, you know, there's a really clear narrative as to why and a logical thought process, but it's then hard, I think, for us sometimes to explain why all of those cases aren't necessarily publicly held. But from my perspective, I think there is more that we could do to be open about the work we're doing, and I think also to reassure people about some of the progress. Sometimes, you know, I spend a lot of time meeting with the brilliant domestic abuse support sector charities and organisations who support victims every day, and I often find that there are some myths and legends about the way policing has done things that I find myself explaining and providing information, and then we all get to a point of saying, oh, now I know, that's much better than I thought. It often makes me think about what we do openly and what we publish, and how important it is. And I think, you know, we're a public sector organisation in policing, so our default position should be about transparency and openness, unless there's really good reason why not. So and I think what I've seen over this last year is an awful lot of, I think, misinformation out there, and also, you know, often people putting two and two together and coming up with a conclusion that isn't quite right. So there's clearly a lot more for us to do in explaining what we do, but making it, you know, ensuring that comes with real transparency and accountability, so that people can get a sense of the scale, get a sense of what happens, and particularly for victims, both inside and outside of policing, to have a good sense of the reality of what happens with a case. And really struck me as part of my work around developing the Met's Violence Against Women and Girls plan, with the support of the London Victims Commission, where I met with a group of victims, and I was really struck by one who talked to me about the research she'd done before coming forward to police and reporting an offence, because she, you know, really wanted to understand what was going to happen and the likelihood of a justice outcome and what that involved. And I thought, actually, it struck me about the, you know, the information we have out there. Does it give people that true picture? Will it engender confidence, and will people feel informed? So clearly more for us to do.
Thank you. Sue, can I come to you as somebody that has previously led a force and is now a member of the public? You've kind of got experiences from both sides. What are your thoughts on current transparency around investigations, and what can be done to increase trust and confidence in future?
Well, I think transparency is still a relatively new concept, I think, in policing, and one that some of those negative aspects of policing culture still struggle with. So it's still very defensive, and, you know, the events of this year have made some officers much more defensive, both at a much more junior level and in terms of the leadership of the service. So I think there's something about how that plays in, and I talked about language earlier. So it's that, I guess it's that sort of confidence, and also to have some humility. And I think that's where, you know, Louisa's leadership, I'm not blowing smoke up your what's it, Louisa, but actually your humility and your humanity just shine through, and that I find really inspiring and really humbling. And I think we need to do more of that, absolutely more of that, because as Louisa said, in the professional standards world, it does feel that the level of transparency that was encouraged and deeply resisted by the service, hasn't made the sort of difference. And in fact, actually almost is showing sort of collusion with, I'm sure some chairs do it exactly as Louisa described, but it does, I think the perception is that officers, the alleged offender is being protected in a way that a victim or witnesses who are going through that process, even in a closed hearing, aren't. And there doesn't feel the sort of explanation, the talking about it in that sort of way. The other bit, of course, is how much the media really want to buy into that sort of open narrative, but that's perhaps a subject for a different episode. But so I think there is that, and there's also the Federation, who sadly weren't able to be represented on this episode, but we hope will be in future ones, is that they do an amazing job representing, supporting, and indeed on some occasions protecting disproportionately their members who are perpetrators. Many of their members are also victims, and where are they stepping up and reflecting that as a significant priority for them? And I think those two bits play hand in hand. So it also goes back to the, what prevents people coming forward is where does the balance of power sit? And that's really important. You also asked Louise about reviews. And I guess I would probably say, there is always a place for a good review, providing it doesn't kick the can down the road. Because I think there has been some real momentum this past year. Caused by all the wrong reasons, but actually a lot of really positive emphasis. My sense, whether it's just sort of Christmas, New Year, Omicron, it does feel a bit that sort of momentum might be slipping a bit now, whether that's government, whether that's policing, whether that's media, whether that's the public, who knows, or maybe a bit of all the above. But there's something about how the momentum is maintained. And long-term reviews are necessary to be thorough, but it almost feels then, so what's happening now? And I think that bit of don't stop doing the right thing, particularly for policing, and indeed trying to influence wider, because I think policing can be a real beacon of good practice, of, dare I say it, the moral high ground. If the police don't have the moral high ground, who on earth does? To work with other parts, whether it's the criminal justice system, with government, with other stakeholders, to start to shift the dial more broadly, whilst also keeping that focus on their own business. I think in terms of reviews, I guess my personal disappointment is the ones commissioned by the Home Secretary on a statutory footing, because I think that would have helped in terms of adding gravitas, but also sending a really important message, not literally in terms of the statutory obligations within it, but in terms of that this is important. Goes back to Jane's point about, this sort of stuff is not as important as other sorts of stuff that are more regularly put on a statutory footing. So I think there is a lot more that can be done. And I guess, sorry, my final point was also about, I was pleased to see that forces were asked to review their sexual misconduct allegations. I guess my question was, isn't that asking you to mark your own homework? Because some of the stories that I've had, and they may be anecdotal, but they're people's real experience as victims, is that those reports are not taken seriously. And when they are, they're diminished. And I could probably talk for a whole episode's worth about some of the experiences that have been relayed to me by the people in professional standards when they've held others in their teams to account for their very poor judgment and investigation quality, to victims who've been ignored, told to go away, that there's not sufficient evidence, they don't really want to go through this, do you? So there's that sense of, and listening to that victim's voice, there could have been a real opportunity here, I think, for policing to have gone more externally, to have asked people who have been really challenging of them with the right sort of skills and knowledge to come and look at what they've been doing. And that opportunity, in my sense, was lost this autumn. Because I think, as I say, I think they're probably still marking their own homework. And I was sorry to see that, but nonetheless, I think policing needs to keep on doing the right thing in the right way, however uncomfortable that might feel, because delivering real change, and particularly addressing some of these, you know, really entrenched sort of cultural norms, is deeply uncomfortable, is deeply painful, and sometimes it's also deeply unpopular with a whole range of different people. But that's leadership. And I think this is the moment for policing to really step up and continue to step up.
Okay, thank you, Sue. In the final 20 minutes, I'm going to ask each of you to review what you think are the key points in terms of willingness to change and looking forward now. So we've looked at things from both sides. We've looked at the kind of real kind of low points and negatives that we can currently see, but then we've also looked at positives, and trying to forge a way forward is where I'd like us to go in the final section of the panel. I'm going to come to Zoe first, because I know you want to come back in, but if we can have a think now about the way forward. What progress has there been that you would identify as examples of good practice? And we've had some of these mentioned already. We've had upstanders, we've had mention of really good initiatives that have taken place where we have seen a difference in terms of particular forces' experiences. And if we're looking at the listeners to the panel, you know, for practical tips in terms of what can forces do, there's two issues. There's obviously the issue in terms of what's going on internally within policing, but also broader societal issues as well. So if we can have a kind of last summary, I'll go around each of you to start to bring things to a kind of concluding sense now. So Zoe, over to you.
I'll try and answer most of that question, Louise, which was a really good question. In terms of looking forwards, I think we've all touched on this in different ways. I think we need to continue to encourage policing to really take violence against women and girls and domestic abuse seriously. And Jane described it in a really clear terms about having a forensic approach to these types of crimes as we would to others. And for me, that's been important ever since my first piece of work on this back in 2013-14, Everyone's Business, where domestic abuse was seen as a sort of Cinderella service, and it was the last thing a police officer wanted to go and attend. I think attitudes have changed massively since then, and the police have really gripped some of these issues around training, understanding of why it's important that police do the things that they do, understanding coercive and controlling behaviour, and understanding the real difference that they can make to a survivor victim's lives by responding in the right way and using very simple police powers that are there for them to use in the right way. And that's you know, a call to arms in the sense of forces doing what they're there to do well and consistently. And Louisa's heard this repeatedly from me. You know, the police have the powers of arrest, they have the powers to investigate. The fact that 3/4 of all domestic abuse reported crime to the police is still NFA'd on the grounds that victim support doesn't support police action is shocking, and we still need to get onto that. In terms of Sue's point about momentum, I couldn't agree more. I think there was this watershed moment in the autumn, and there are signs that the watershed is beginning to diminish. And I think it's really vital that collectively police forces, but also the government, leans in to reconfirm its express intentions relating to the prioritisation of domestic abuse related crimes. And it is a bit technical, so apologies, but certainly the inspectorate, when I was there, and the report led by me, was very clear that in order to up the priority of domestic abuse and violence against women and girls, we should include tackling violence against women and girls in the strategic policing requirement, which is the government's basic statement of what are the high-level harm crimes that every single force in the country has to have regard to, and work out a strategy for resolving across a partnership landscape. And I think pressing for that to be a key commitment that the government sticks with and actually acts on is really, really important. So maintain the momentum, ask the police to continue to do what they're doing well and use the powers that they have as quite extraordinary members of our community. But going back to the first bit of our conversation, the bit that's the most difficult within all of this is continue to see police leaders working to create a culture in which this type of behaviour is no longer tolerated through the various mechanisms and means that we've discussed as a group today.
Excellent, thank you, Zoe. Jane, can I come to you next, please, for your thoughts?
Yeah, really interesting and difficult question, I think, to answer in such a short time. But I'm going to reiterate, I think, some of the things I've already said. And one is about the status of violence against women and girls and the crimes, and the status of women as victims, and trying to see, to get rid of the victim blaming. Victim blaming is absolutely, it's embedded in, not just in policing, in everywhere in the culture, is that we look, when a woman is a victim, we look to see how she contributed to the offending against her. I mean, it's something that's talked about a lot, but all of the talking doesn't seem to have changed many of the practices. And I don't think it's just a simple case of this is men versus women, because I think that this culture, and a police culture, women are inculcated into it as much as men are. So it's not that binary of men and women. So it needs to be that we raise the status of women as victims, as truthful commentators, maybe, or at least have that have that belief when you start the conversation, and challenging the victim blaming narratives, because police have an awful lot of power in setting the narrative. So I see this when I'm working in homicide especially. So the way that the police initially assess maybe a sudden and unexpected death can then feed through the system, and because the police are trusted commentators, because their testimony is seen as expert and trustworthy, they will be believed over other voices. So the coroner will rely on the police, and why shouldn't they? They should, and lawyers will rely on the police. So we have to make sure that that narrative set by the police in the earliest stages of a crime, that's the most important time, that's going to be challenged and changed maybe. And so I'd just like to talk just very briefly then about frontline response officers. So I don't know if my experience of hearing people talk about frontline officers is the reality, but it seems to me that frontline response officers are seen as kind of the baseline of policing, the generalists. Frontline responding is a specialism. It takes expertise. The kind of decisions that frontline officers are taking on a daily basis can have massive repercussions, serious repercussions. And if they are setting the narrative and they are the most junior officers, that's a problem for policing, because it seems sometimes that as this narrative travels through the system, it will be defended by people with better knowledge. It will be defended by more senior officers, and not necessarily challenged. So I think we also perhaps need to raise the status of frontline officers so that they are considered as experts. And I don't know also if this is necessarily the reality, but it seems to me that specialism in the police doesn't have the gravitas that it used to. It's almost as if you have to have tried every single department to have the experience to be a police officer, rather than encouraging maybe a career choice for certain areas of policing, or at least for many, many years at a time, rather than moving from department to department to department where expertise is becoming diluted. And perhaps frontline policing is one of those expert areas. I'd also just like to talk very, very briefly about taking a forensic approach. I think it's really important. The police are experts. Their testimony matters. Their testimony has power, and it should be based in expertise, and it should be a forensic approach. And I think that the new policing framework, as my final point, with the three pillars of building trust and perpetrator pursuit and safer spaces, they're quite broad. They're quite, and I hope that we're going to see a lot more digging down into what that actually means, because some of these things we could say should already be in place, but they're not. So how are we actually going to dig down into those three pillars, which I think are really, really important? And if we do that, I think that will, and have those conversations, that will maybe keep the momentum going or restart the momentum.
Excellent, thank you, Jane. Sue, can I come to you? I've got a developing list of key points here. So do you want to add anything in, or pick up on anything, expand on anything that's been put forward?
Yeah, I'll try not to be too repetitive, but 3 points. Firstly, that the police continue to hold their nerve. There's a tendency in policing that all of a sudden there'll be a new shiny thing to pursue, there'll be another priority, there'll be another emergency. This has to have consistent, high-profile, committed leadership, and it isn't going away, and it certainly won't go away unless we have that sort of leadership from policing, and indeed, of course, broader, as we've talked about. Secondly, we need to change the narrative, and that's through action, behaviours and language. Jane's talked incredibly eloquently about victim blaming, so I won't rehearse that. But again, around professional standards, Zoe's talked again very passionately and clearly about the need to reframe what we want from a police officer, and from pre-recruitment onwards through reward and recognition, and to sort of out the other side. And then finally, I think this means that we need to stop talking about managing violence against women and girls and male violence in policing, but actually preventing it, and having a preventative approach and strategy, of which there will be elements of management, but the fundamental basis is this is about prevention, not around management.
Excellent, thank you, Sue. Louisa, can I come to you finally for your thoughts and responses to any of the points that have been made by the other panellists?
Yes, thank you. Just to build on that. So I think it's really important. We've now got the National Police Chiefs Council framework for delivery around violence against women and girls. We've all signed up to that. We've now got to deliver it. And as Sue says, hold our nerve. Violence against women and girls must unequivocally be a priority for policing. All forces have signed up to that. Let's now make it happen. Delivering evidence-based practice, all the learning that's come from the Oppositariat approach around rape and sexual offences will apply across all violence against women and girls, addressing particularly the mainstream behaviours that we see in policing that we don't like around, as you've described, the status of victims, but also in the wider justice system, having a more trauma-informed approach to justice, where people are, we've got a justice system that's adversarial, that I think at the moment, unfortunately, influences officers to seek a sort of chink in the credibility of a victim rather than pursuing the perpetrator. And we want to pursue the perpetrator. But I think a fundamental point for me is, for us as police leaders, not seeing this as distinct from or separate to our wider work around inclusion, because I think inclusive cultures create healthier behaviours. And actually, the more inclusive our culture, the more that we are likely to have people who will be comfortable challenging the status quo and challenging bad things when they happen. So I think we shouldn't see this as distinct from an awful lot of work we're doing elsewhere on trust and confidence too. It should all be part of that big picture of transparency, accountability, and a healthy policing culture that really roots this out. And as Zoe said, there's no place for policing in abusers and for abusers, and we've got to drive this really hard and maintain that momentum.
Okay, thank you all very much. We've got some fantastic suggestions there and ways forward from our forensic approaches, eradicating victim blaming. One of the things that we're going to be looking at later on in this series is the role of men, and men as part of the solution, which is something that's been touched upon a couple of times as well. So as part of that episode, we're going to be looking at and discussing with those that are actually doing this work. So men's-based programs, creation of allies and bystanders is something else to add into the mix, which I think picks up on quite a few of the key points that we've had so far. There's a real emphasis around the changes to the criminal justice system. So obviously very broader issues here that are being touched upon, and the adversarial nature of that, alongside victim blaming and getting rid of victim blaming. Coming back to what Zoe mentioned really early on as well, the importance of early intervention, vetting, the status of frontline response officers, and then coming back to the point about timing and about that lack of momentum that's starting to seep in. It's absolutely essential that we don't lose that momentum that we had throughout 2021, and we start to capitalise on that, particularly through what Louise has just mentioned there in terms of the importance of inclusive cultures and changing the narrative. And coming back to a point that you'd made earlier, Louisa, as well, about really, I guess, raising the profile of the importance of empathy in policing and breaking away from that very, very, very traditional hero culture and emphasis that's very there and very prevalent, you know, and that feeds through to recruitment as well. And one of the things that we haven't focused on today, but that we will be focusing on again in future episodes, is thinking about people wanting to come into policing. You know, what kind of diverse culture do we want to have? What kind of diverse workforce do we want to have? And I think, again, that's part of this broader cultural narrative that public sector organisations, corporates globally are grappling with at the moment, and attracting diversity into forces, again, is part of this fantastic work that's going on. And let's keep that momentum there, and long may this continue. For those of you that are listening, we really hope that you have enjoyed listening to the debate, and we've touched upon some, you know, really difficult, complex, nuanced issues here. But we hope that as audience members, you've got some tips and workable solutions that you can implement within the forces that you work within. And if you're coming at this from an academic perspective, we really hope that we've given you a set of ideas and things to follow up. So what I'd like to do to finish off is, first of all, thank Policing TV for setting up the debates, and for this as the first episode. We hope that this has given an overarching structure to the debates that will follow. A very huge thank you from me to all of you as panel members. Thank you so much for your candidness, for your honesty, and for your absolutely fantastic insights. Very much value your time, and I would like to say I hope that all of the fantastic work that you've all been doing continues, and that the momentum that is there does continue moving forward. So thank you all very, very much.